Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is well, and welcome to this second session of the module on market access for trading goods in this virtual course. As you know, the last discussion we've had on Wednesday concerned the background of how the COVID pandemic had impacted international trade. And then we had a conversation about some of the trade restricting measures that members had taken in the context of their fight against the pandemic. And I would advise those perhaps that could not watch the presentation and could not join us during the question and answer session to join, to check the YouTube channel of the organization and to check the presentation there, because I think it's a nice complement to what we are going to see today. The focus today is still similar. We'll still be talking about how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted world trade, but we'll be focusing this time on the trade facilitating measures that members have taken in order to fight the pandemic. We saw, in fact, on Wednesday that international trade is a central component of the way access health-related goods, because most countries are net importers of this good, and therefore they procure these goods in international markets. So it is important also to make sure that we can facilitate access to these goods. So let me quickly share my screen, and we'll start with the presentation. Sorry, for some reason it's not working. Let me try again. Yeah, now it is here. So okay. So as I said, we'll be focusing then on the trade facilitating measures, and there are three main issues we'd like to discuss with you. How trade can be facilitated through some of the existing instruments that we have in the WTO. I will be speaking about that first part. What additional temporary measures members have taken in the context of the pandemic. Simon will be talking about these measures. And then last, what are some of the proposals that members have made in the various WTO committees to adopt measures to facilitate trade and fight against the pandemic? And Roy will be speaking about that. So as we did on Wednesday, you'll be hearing from both myself, Simon, and Roy again. So what are the existing that the WTO has to facilitate trade on health-related products? There are three instruments that I'd like to review with you. The Pharmaceutical Sectoral Agreement, the Information Technology Sectoral Agreement, and the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Now, these three agreements build on the premise that tariffs and administrative costs build in the value chain of these products and end up increasing the costs for economic operators, but ultimately for consumers as well. So the idea is that if we remove these costs, the costs related to tariffs and administrative costs in international trade of health products, we end up with cheaper and more accessible health products. So let me illustrate now this through these three initiatives that we have in the WTO. The Pharmaceutical Agreement first. This is a sectoral plurilateral agreement that was adopted in 1994 by 8 WTO members, and this is counting the EU and its member states, the European Union and its member states, as one participant. This sectoral agreement covers approximately 7,000 pharmaceutical agreements, and the idea is to eliminate tariffs, so to bring tariffs to zero on all finished pharmaceutical products, but also on the chemical components and on the pharmaceutical components that are used to produce finished pharmaceutical products. So you see this idea that tariffs build up not finished products, but if we eliminate tariffs on the value chain, we end up with more competitive and cheaper end products. So this initiative, as I said, was adopted in 1994, but despite being plurilateral, the concessions are reflected in WTO schedules of the participating members, and therefore they apply on an MFN basis to all WTO members. So the result of that is, even though the 8 WTO members that participate in this initiative have agreed to eliminate tariffs among themselves, these tariff liberalizations apply to all other WTO members who export covered items to these members. This initial agreement that dates from 1994 is a living agreement because it contained a provision that it would be regularly updated to keep pace with technology and the development of new pharmaceuticals and new substances. So it has been reviewed and expanded in 1996, in 1998, in 2007, and in 2010, as you see here on screen. And each of these reviews or expansions has added additional items to this agreement. So we now have a total of about 7,000 finished products and intermediary components, which are covered by the pharmaceutical agreement. And the full list, the full indicative list of these items is contained in document job/MA/142, as you see referenced here on your screen. Now, the 5th review of this agreement should be launched at any time. This is really in the hands of participants. But as I said, the idea is that the agreement is regularly updated. Every time one of these updates or reviews or expansions takes place, the participants then incorporate these additional concessions in their schedule through the 1980 procedures for the rectification of schedules. The pharmaceutical agreement has a peculiar structure among WTO agreements, and the reason for this is that it doesn't rely only on the identification of HS codes. Let me explain this to you now. Pharmaceutical components are not always easily identifiable through their HS codes. If you remember from our conversation on Wednesday, we were saying that the harmonized system nomenclature is not sufficiently detailed or sufficiently granular to identify with precision very specific products. And this is very, very clear with chemical products and other pharmaceutical components that are used for finished pharmaceutical products. As a result of that, the agreement actually has different annexes that identify the products covered in this agreement, either through their HS codes, when these codes are clear, and this is very explicit, for instance, for finished pharmaceutical products of Chapter 30. But then the agreement also identifies covered products through their product description, for instance, giving the chemical name or the chemical formula of some of these components. The agreement also utilizes what we call CAS codes. These are codes managed by the Chemical Abstract Service and which identify with a specific number and code chemical products. And then it also identifies these products through INN codes. These are international non-proprietary names that are attributed and managed by the World Health Organization and which concern pharmaceutical substances. So through a combination of these various codes, members are able to identify with precision the items that are covered in the agreement. And as I explained earlier, there are over 7,000 items covered. So quite a complex method for the identification of these goods. And therefore, if you check the document summarizing this initiative, you will see that there are annexes reflecting this complex structure. So the pharmaceutical agreement is the first initiative I'd like to present today. The second one is the information technology agreement. Now, you might find it surprising that we would like to talk about ITA in the context of COVID-19. And the reason for this is that this sectoral plurilateral initiative that was adopted in 1996 was renegotiated and expanded in 2015. And during that expansion or renegotiation of the agreement, some health-related products were added to the list of products that, for which tariffs were eliminated as well. So we have 54 WTO members participating in the original ITA that dates from 1996, and we have 25 other WTO members that have also subscribed to the 2015 ITA expansion ministerial declaration. So this is again counting the EU and its member states as one. And what this 25 WTO members did is to expand the list of products that were covered in the original ITA agreement to add more products, some of which have a health application. I'll present them in a second. But the interesting thing about the ITA and the ITA expansion is that, like the pharma, these are also concessions that are incorporated in the schedules of participating members. And once they are incorporated in the schedules of the participating members, they also apply on an MFN basis. And as a result, even countries that are not participants of the ITA can export goods covered in this sectoral agreement to the participating members on a duty-free basis, because, as I said, all the covered products have a tariff of 0 for participating members. Now, what are some of the health-related products that are covered by the ITA expansion agreement? You see them here on screen. It's just under 20 tariff lines. Some of them correspond, as you can see here, to a clear tariff HS code nomenclature. Others are identified, as you see here, by a more specific code. And we have products like magnetic, electrocardiogram, or tomography machines. We have pacemakers. We have ophthalmic instruments. So a number of products, as you see here, that have a health application and therefore also have a bearing for, of course, fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, both instruments, both the pharma and the ITA sectoral agreements, are open for participation by any WTO member that would be interested. And of course, if your government wishes to join any of these agreements, I'd be happy to explain further about how that is done. The bottom line being, of course, that the governments have to accept to bind their tariffs on the covered products at 0 and reflect that in their WTO schedules. Of course, of these agreements is that they keep tariffs permanently down, permanently at 0 for all these covered products, irrespective, of course, of the pandemic. So these are not temporary tariff eliminations, but permanent tariff elimination. The third and last instrument which I would like to present to you is the Trade Facilitation Agreement. I'm sure you are familiar with this agreement, that this is the most recent agreement adopted by WTO members. It entered into force in 2017, once 2/3 of the membership ratified this instrument. And as you know, the TFA aims at modernizing customs procedures and simplifying all the import and export administrative procedures and fees. There's a very clear commitment made in the TFA, whereby members would review their procedures, simplify them as possible, where possible, and that includes also taxes and fees associated with import and export operations. And as a result of this review, of this simplification, of this modernization, of the adoption of technologies and best practices related to import-export procedures, as a result of this members would be cutting trading costs. And by cutting trade costs, again, we would be contributing to a reduction of the costs of accessing health-related products. In the WTO 2015 World Trade Report, the Secretariat has estimated that the global implementation of this agreement, of the entire agreement, would lead to a reduction of almost 15% of trading costs. So this is really quite significant. As you know, the TFA has a customized implementation schedule. Each WTO developing or least developed member can decide autonomously on the pace and sequencing of implementation of this agreement. So what I'm showing here to you on screen is the latest status of implementation of the agreement. There's almost 70% of measures that are currently already implemented by the membership. And as you can see here, based on the information that has been notified to the Secretariat so far, the agreement would continue to be implemented until 2038. That's the last date that has been notified to us by WTO members for the full implementation of the agreement. What you see here is in purple, implementation by developed countries. And for these countries, implementation is already full. It's 100% of the agreement already implemented by WTO developed members. And then what you see then in the other shades, in green, in blue, and in red, is the implementation by developing countries and LDCs, who, as I said, can have additional time, can use additional time to implement the agreement. Now, these are the three initiatives I'd like to present. And what I propose now is that we move to the temporary measures. What I presented are the existing permanent measures that exist in the WTO members. And now let's move with Simon to the temporary measures.
Okay. Good morning also, and good afternoon.
Simon, you're on mute.
I shall not.
No, we can hear you.
You can hear me now, Dalan?
Yes.
Okay. And you also see my screen, right? Okay. So good morning also from my side. You might have noticed I actually slightly changed the name of the slide. I will be talking about trade facilitation, but to make it more clear, I will be talking more general about trade facilitating measures. This means that we will not only look at the trade facilitation agreement, but also at other initiatives by members that facilitate trade. And we looked at different trade volumes on Wednesday, on how trade changed throughout the year, but we didn't really talk about tariffs yet. So let's take a quick look how tariffs on medical goods changed, or what there were in those products at all. What we can look at the average MFN applied duties of medical goods related to COVID-19 are at about close to 5%. Then for medicines, they are much lower at about 2%. But then when we go up towards the personal protective equipment, then we see that the protective and cleaning products are up at even 11%. What we also see here is that the tariffs also change quite substantially across members. So here's a distribution that shows that for some members, for example, face masks for 7 members are like 0 to 2.5, but for 15 members, they are above 15%. I'll let you look at this a bit in more detail, just to tell you that there's really quite some change across the different products across members. When we look at imports and MFN tariffs, specifically of face masks, we see that the red ones are the tariffs and the blue ones are import volumes. We can see that tariffs, for example, for textile masks are on average close to 14%. And then when we go to the category of gas masks, which are highly specialized masks that they might use in intensive care units, for example, they go down to 2%. And we can also, we see an idea of what trade in those products were in the first half of 2020. So when we talk about trade in essential products, some have heard this expression of the triple whammy effect of the trade in those COVID-19 related products. There was a demand shock, so everybody wants those products. There was a supply shock. Also, since not all of the factories were operating in the beginning, so there was limited supply, and there was especially a big disruption of global transport services, so air, land, and sea. So was this the perfect storm for global supply chains? And what was the reaction by the actors? So they hit the emergency button. So what did they do about the demand shock? This is what we saw on Wednesday. They restricted exports. So to be sure that there's enough of those goods available at the local market. And to deal with the supply shock, there was also a lot of impact initiatives to facilitate imports. In order, there's not so much available and exports are also restricted. So to make it easier for those products to arrive, a lot of members facilitated imports. And in order to deal with those disruptions of global transport services, a lot of in the early phase of the pandemic, there were a lot of planes chartered essentially to make sure that the essential goods move quickly. So now when we talk about those trade facilitating measures, the rationale behind this, I mean, everybody wants to fight this pandemic as good as possible, and not all of those products are produced by all countries on the world. So in order to import as quickly and cheaply as possible, it's good to facilitate trade with certain measures. There was also quite some initiatives to make sure that international markets remain open and to minimize the risk of a bigger economic crisis on top of the health crisis, for example, to avoid a food crisis. We saw a few measures that were restricting also food imports as a result of COVID-19, but these really remained limited. And some of them were only there for a week, and then pressure was so big so that those measures were removed soon after. And then there were also big political statements in the beginning, like the G20 leader statement, to foster international cooperation to overcome the crisis. As a result, in the latest trade monitoring exercise, 195 trade facilitating measures have been counted. And those are more than the trade restricting measures as well that we discussed on Wednesday. Those were about, I think, 140 or so. So what do we mean actually by those trade facilitating measures? When we mean about trade facilitating measures, we think about transparency to ensure that trade operators know what happens, and that all traders have the necessary information available. What we also saw, what is not typical that within the trade facilitation agreement, but is clearly a trade facilitating measure, is the reduction or elimination of tariffs, taxes, and other charges. So for those COVID-19 goods, it has been the case that the really tariffs have been reduced substantially for about 40 members. Then also there was a value-added tax exemption in many cases. And what we've also even seen is that the medical actors, like hospitals, for example, that they can import the goods they need, even if they're not typically classified as a medical good, duty-free in this pandemic, and also for the police, for example. Then what we've also seen is the simplification or elimination of, for example, import licensing procedures for COVID-19 goods to relax origin requirements, So meaning that you don't need to show an original or certificate of origin for certain goods related to COVID-19, but you can show a copy, for example. Then labeling requirements have also been relaxed, or other requirements. So we can say that it's really the red carpet for the COVID-19 goods has been rolled out. So the COVID-19 liner could move all the goods easier to the country. Other examples are also the simplification of import or export procedures. So how do we cut red tape? So you've probably heard about like green lanes for those essential products to move goods related to COVID-19 faster across borders, to have the clearance procedures faster, then to have strengthened pre-arrival procedures, and have more paperless transactions, since also customs at the border was heavily affected, or still is heavily affected. And also to have more digital procedures to avoid physical contact. There were also quite many simplifications of transit procedures. That is, how can we best help our neighbors? And then there were also the several separate health protocols established for staff dealing with import and export procedures to make sure that trade keeps flowing. We've seen this recently when this big outbreak happened in the UK also, that for the first day or so, that all border crossings have been stopped, but then soon after, there have been special procedures so that trade keeps flowing from the UK to the rest of the European Union. And with this, I'll give the floor to Roy, who will talk to you about what are some of the actual proposals to facilitate access to COVID-19 products, which are currently being discussed.
Okay, let's continue the discussion from this point. Before I begin with the proposals, I thought it would be interesting for you also to see this point in terms of the, let's say, more political type of statements. And we have had actually a huge amount of these political statements that have been made. And what I did is we have one section in the WTO webpage. I'm going to show it to you in a few minutes, where you can actually see all these different statements. And what is interesting is the timing of many of these statements. So what I did is I put them on screen following a sort of a chronological order. And then you see that even from March, April, May, which is really, let's say, when the pandemic was really becoming more apparent, most of the countries were under lockdowns, and all sorts of other, let's say, very strict type of measures were being implemented in terms of the health protocols. You can see that ministers were actually quite busy meeting in Zoom, just like we're doing now, or through some other platforms, and then discussing what could trade do in order to help to redress some of these situations, right? So there was actually quite a lot of activity, I think, especially during the first part of last year. We are going to be giving you the slides, and I don't know if you see that some of them, the dates are in green, so you're going to be able to actually click, and then you are going to be able to see all these documents in case you would like to read them. But let me make your life easier, because I think the messages were quite common. So this is my take on all those different declarations. And I think in our website, we have something like 20 of them. I am sure there are more than that. So what was the typical content of these political messages? First one is acknowledgement that this is a very unprecedented challenge in the world. We had really not faced something like this before, at least not in modern times. And therefore, since this is a global problem, then international cooperation is essential to tackle the pandemic, right? So there is perhaps little that could be done just by one single country. We need all countries doing and taking action to be able to tackle the pandemic in an effective manner. Second point, and I think Simon already mentioned this point, is trade must keep flowing. when the lockdowns were first implemented, and I think we discussed this on Monday, it happened that international trade for a couple of weeks completely stopped. Completely stopped because people in customs were not able to go to work, or, for example, the people in the ports were not able to unload the cargo in terms of both imports and exports. And this, of course, created a very big problem, because we are all dependent, or actually interdependent, in terms of food, essential medical products, but also many other products from other countries, right? So if trade stops, we really are completely aggravating, creating an unnecessary, perhaps additional shock to the economy. So it was very important for trade ministers, when they were meeting, what do we do to make sure that trade keeps flowing? Because if it completely stops, then this is not just going to be health crisis, it's going to become a full-blown economic crisis that is going to affect all of us. So I think Simon already mentioned some of the measures that were implemented, not only in respect of trade, but also with respect to health protocols, declaration of, for example, many of these workers being essential for purposes of exempting them from some of these restrictions, and so on and so forth. Still, apparently, despite some of these actions, at least the, let's say, the companies that deal with the movement of some of these goods, they still complain that apparently there are still problems with respect to, for example, the possibility of docking the ships, or with respect to some of the movement of the crews that are moving planes, the people who are driving trucks, and so on and so forth. Third element that is very common in these messages is, please do your best to avoid export restrictions. And I think here ministers were quite careful in many of these statements. You don't see, don't do it because you don't have a right. That's really not the message. Is, yes, you probably have the legal right, but please, please, please try to do it in a way that is only when you really need it. Make sure that the measures are targeted. That means only on the products that you really need it. Then do it in a proportionate manner. If you have different options, please try to do the one which is least trade restrictive. If you are going to do it, be transparent. Transparency, as we saw the first day, is extremely important, because trade operators need to know what is going on. If they don't know what is going on, then the impact on trade can be much more severe than if you actually have this transparency. Now, we know that this is a health emergency. We may understand why you're doing this for the moment, but please make sure that this is temporary. That means do not introduce a permanent type of measures that are going to disrupt trade on a more permanent basis. Please try to have some form of review, and then you can actually determine whether those measures can be removed afterwards. Also, one part that was, of course, important for us to see was that they also asked for these measures to be consistent with WTO rules. Now, if you are following all the other previous elements that are mentioned in these statements, in terms of being targeted, proportionate, transparent, temporary, not creating unnecessary barriers to trade, etc., you are most likely already complying with the WTO rules, because this is precisely what we try to achieve with the rules. Another element, and this was already also mentioned by Simon, look, we are already having problems with respect to these essential medical goods. Please do not spill this over to other sectors. And at some point, food was particularly concerning, because there was plenty of food, let's say in terms of harvest, production, there was no problem at all. But because it became difficult to move products, and there was uncertainty, in some cases, some members imposed export restrictions on food products as well. For example, on products like rice and some other essential foodstuffs, which are really traded, and many countries are net food importing of these products, right? So there was a big effort, and I think ministers were actually quite successful in terms of stopping the spread or contagion of these export restrictions into other markets. Final element that you can see in many of these trade, declarations is basically, as soon as the emergency is over, please lift the measures so we can return to normal. And in fact, this is something that Simon explained on Monday. We have seen that particularly with export restrictions, there are many of these that have been already lifted and they are not in place anymore. However, as we're entering into a new phase of the pandemic, others are coming up. Third element, and this is something that has already been mentioned by Simon and Simon, try to facilitate trade, in particular with respect to essential medical goods. And this has been done really by a wide range of countries around the world. One element that we have also discussed on Monday was, look, whatever measures you take have an impact on other countries. So please, before you act, bear in mind the negative impact that some of those measures may have on least developed countries and some of the other more vulnerable countries. And when I mention the vulnerable countries here, I would like to mention one special category that I think we have not mentioned before, which is the landlocked countries. We have also spoken a lot about import-export type of procedures, but there are also other procedures which are important for these countries, which are the transit procedures. So, for example, if you are going to be able to import goods into some of these landlocked countries, they necessarily need to go through other countries. So there was also a call to try to expedite these transit procedures to ensure that all countries were able to get these goods as quickly as possible. And finally, again, the issue of transparency. Even if you are doing trade facilitating measures, please make sure that everybody knows that these are being put in place. Now, besides these different types of, let's say, political declarations, we have had a few proposals, and the proposals are being discussed at different levels. So, for example, in the General Council, we have at least 3 different proposals. And here I am using the word proposal in a broader term because I included also one which I thought is interesting for you to see, which is this action plan that was introduced by many Pacific countries, including Australia, New Zealand, Brunei, and others, where they actually had a very detailed, let's say, set of actions that they thought were necessary to facilitate trade and make sure that the disruption in international trade was the least possible. Then we also have a proposal by the Ottawa group, which is called Focusing Action on COVID-19. But I think this one has evolved and into this other one, which is called the Trade and Health Initiative that was presented in November last year. And the idea of this proposal is twofold. First, the idea is to have some form of political declaration or endorsement by the WTO members in terms of why it is important to take action with respect to COVID-19, which would then be followed by specific type of negotiations, discussions on several different areas, like, for example, on export restrictions with respect to customs procedures, services, technical regulations, tariffs, transparency, and review. And I think according to them, the main goal that they would have is to have this sort of political declaration being issued by the end of March, if I remember correctly, so the other discussions can begin soon. So this is ongoing. Of course, this has not been agreed yet, but if you're involved in the discussions that have to do with the General Council, it's something you probably need to pay attention. Then we also have proposals in the Committee on Trade Facilitation. I'm going to be giving you some more details on this afterwards. And then there was also this proposal under the TRIPS Council, which has to do with a waiver proposal. But as we said on Monday, this has to do mostly with intellectual property. So this particular proposal, we are not going to be discussing. Now, where do you find these proposals? And I thought this would actually be quite interesting for you. So let me show you. So this is the WTO webpage. I told you I was gonna show you why you became famous. So you are, some of you, in the WTO webpage. This is a picture that was taken by Paulo and then was added to this particular section. But if you go below our picture, there is this section on COVID-19. And then we have this, if you click here on full details, so we actually aggregate all the information we produce or is produced by other organizations and we think is relevant for purposes of trade. We actually put in this particular section, and it has grown quite a lot over time. So sometimes it's not so easy to find. So I just wanted to show you this column you have here on the left. It lists the main types of sections. And then there is one of them, which is called WTO members proposals, all proposals. And then you actually go to a big table that gives you access. It lists the different types of proposals, gives you the dates, gives you the proponents. And then if you click on any of them, you're also able to download them. Now, here it's called proposals, but in fact, many of them are these political declarations that I mentioned before. So that's why I thought it was important to tell you that it is actually a mix of both things, political declarations and actual proposals that are being discussed in the WTO. So let me go back to my presentation. So this you're going to be able to find. Now, in terms of the committees, I told you on Wednesday that there's quite a lot of work that is taken on, but I thought it would actually be interesting to tell you the type of work that is being done. So I have here a summary, and if I am honest, I was surprised, it took me almost a full day to prepare this slide because it was not so easy for me to find the information. So I guess if it's difficult for me, it's probably even more difficult for you. So the way I designed the slide is that it also has hyperlinks. So for example, if you are more interested in terms of what's happening in the Committee on Agriculture, you can just click on any of the hyperlinks and you are able to get the documents immediately. So what has happened in the committees? It's interesting because the approach that has been taken actually changes quite a lot from one committee to the other. In some of them, the emphasis has been on compiling information. So for example, you see in the Committee on Agriculture, Committee on Market Access, there are these compilations of measures where the emphasis has been on trying to understand exactly what is happening. So for the moment, there are not really proposals that are being discussed, but what you have is an exercise of transparency and being able to make sure that you are really capturing all the information which is out there on these issues. Not only you try to capture the information, but you also have these information sharing sessions where the idea is you try to exchange information and better understand what is happening with respect to some of these measures. So both in the Committee on Agriculture and the Committee on Market Access, I think it has been a similar type of exercise as just described. Then you have the SPS and TBT measures, where they actually have received a lot of information in terms of the notifications. So I think for them, the identification part is not really an issue. So they jumped directly into the sharing of these experiences, informations, and then the idea of sharing experiences in this context is, what is the best way or what has been some of the best practices for tackling specific issues. If I can give you one, which for me is quite interesting, and Simon already mentioned, that has to do with labeling. So there is one country where English and French are the official language, and they had one technical regulation that said that in order to import any product, be it medical equipment or some of this product protection equipment, you actually have to have a label in both English and French. And at some point they said, look, do we really want to prevent importation of products because of this? So they removed that requirement and actually allowed the importation if it was in either of those two languages. So this is just to give you an idea of how sometimes these technical regulations can also have a big impact in terms of the availability that you may be able to get for importing some of these products. Then the last example, which I think is yet different from the way it has been handled by the others, and is the trade facilitation agreement. And in here, they have had, in fact, let me show you the information. I also included the information on the notifications. Very few notifications. And the thing with these notifications in the trade facilitation agreement is they are not really designed to capture information like the one we would like to have for discussing, let's say, the impact of COVID-19. They are more designed, for example, to take account of changes in the import-export procedures or changes in inquiry points, the different websites where the information is available. So that has not really changed much, but the contents of what is included in some of these websites or what the inquiry points are doing, of course, is what has changed. So there are some proposals in the context of the TFA to do two things. First one is, look, if you are having problems implementing, let's say, or facilitating trade with respect to many of these aspects, first thing you need to do is, in fact, expedite the implementation of the trade facilitation measures. And this is what Darlan was showing you before. I don't know if you remember, he showed you a chart where you have the implementation. So you have the A, B, C categories. So there were already plans to implement many of these measures, but then there were long-term plans or medium-term plans. So the idea is, what can we do to actually make sure that those plans are implemented in a faster way than before? And if I can just mention one specific example, copies. Copies became a problem now with the pandemic, right? Because if you can transmit the virus because the droplets fall in the paper and then the paper can be transmitting the disease, the last thing that you want is that your customs or other government agencies are exposed to the transmission of the virus. So there was a very big movement to try to digitize as much as possible to protect the people who are dealing with the procedures and also the traders, right? To minimize the impact of transmission of the disease. Second proposal, this one is by the European Union, has to do with improving the type of experience sharing that you are doing in the committee on trade facilitation. And in fact, I just wanted to show you this link on the trade facilitation database because there is a lot of information in there. Sorry, let me try to do that again. So if you open the link, you go to this trade facilitation agreement database, and I just wanted to show you, there is one dedicated section on COVID-19. If you open it, you actually have a huge amount of presentations, documents, not only by members, but also by international organizations that tell you, let's say, some of the measures that have been implemented, but also some of the best practices, what has gone well, what has not gone so well with respect to these measures. So I thought that is a very important source of information for you. Sorry, I think I took already a lot of time, and this is just the end of my presentation. The last point I wanted to make is that, in addition, there is one proposal being discussed in the context of the Council for Trading Goods, which is the one that oversees the activities of all these committees in the goods areas, where the idea is there something that the CTG can do to oversee and have some discussions with respect to all these measures that are being implemented. And this was a proposal by about 8 members. Colombia is one of the main ones that was leading the discussions. Joined, I remember as well, Singapore, Canada, and some others. Now, for this proposal, yet there has been no consensus, and some members are a bit concerned that they would actually like to keep the discussions in the committees themselves rather than bringing the issue to the CTG. So this is the end of my presentation, and then we will be happy to answer questions.